Good evening. My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
We
are
the Dungeon
Dudes.
Welcome to our August patron Q&A discussion. We are so excited because we are on the cusp of launching our next Kickstarter project this upcoming Monday, Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakenheim.
This is going to be a source book for 5th edition, and it's going to introduce a whole bunch of new player options, as well as expanded lore on the setting of Drakenheim. And we got a ton of questions. I think we got over 60 questions from our patrons. We tried our best to weed out repetitive questions and get rid of anything that we think that we're going to be answering as we go through this. And we've narrowed it down to about 25 questions. So hopefully we cover what everybody wants to hear, and we get to talk a lot about all the goodies coming to you soon. And most of them will be unveiled on Monday, which is coming up. And so we're just excited. Plus, everybody's getting their hands on the first Kickstarter currently, which is also really exciting.
Yeah, it's super awesome. We've been seeing all of the unboxing photos and videos that people have taken from the first Kickstarter project, getting them in their hands. I think there's a few people that are still in the last leg of the shipping journey. Like they're waiting for their local delivery courier to get it to their house. But rest assured that for all of you that if you are in that position, every order has shipped for the first Dungeons of Drakkenheim Kickstarter project. It's all been manufactured. It's all been finished. And please, 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 if you are having any problems at all with your delivery, please get in contact with our fulfillment team as soon as possible, because we can resolve things, whether if in the off chance, you missed the delivery because you weren't at home, or you opened the package and you got too many of one card and not enough of another, or some random thing like that. We can fix all these things, so please let us know. Get in touch with us with the fulfillment team. But tonight, we've got a bunch of questions about the next Kickstarter project for Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakenheim, as well as some questions about DMing for D&D 5e. And we thought we would kick off with some of those to kind of warm up the mood. If you're joining us in chat this evening, please be aware that we're going to take our patron questions first. We want to give them the first opportunity to ask their burning questions. And then we will be rolling on, take a couple questions from chat as well. Maybe go back through some of the other patron questions that we submitted, because we did have a few duplicates this time. Actually, it was interesting. A lot of people asking a bit of the same question. So if we don't answer your question, our sincere apologies. Thank you for submitting that. We're just trying to navigate with time and make sure that we can cover as much as we possibly can. So let's dive in, Kelly. What's our first question?
Our first question is from Shuvaroop. Thanks for including pronunciation guide there. That's good. So Shuvaroop asks, how do you provide the party with hooks for different adventures in a completely open world sandbox game? Well, one thing that we've implemented in Dungeons of Drakkenheim, and we've implemented again in Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakenheim, is the use of rumors. Something that I like to do is, especially in an open world game, is you make a list of one sentence hooks that will guide players to different areas. And I try to write as many of these as I can. And then when they're in the tavern, or they're talking to somebody and they're like, hey, what's going on around town? Any news or any business? You can have them talk about a rumor. You can look down at your sheet and be like, oh yeah, there's like 8 little adventure hooks that I could send the party on. You choose one of them and you let them know the rumor, and they get to do with that what they will. So they still have the option to choose whether to pursue the rumor or not. But I like to make these lists well in advance. Even if I don't have the entire adventure planned out, one might just be like, there are owl bears in a cave causing problems. And I'll just riff on that for a minute. Local bar dude says, oh yeah, owl bears ate my horse and now it's a problem. I need somebody to take care of that for me. And there you have an adventure hook. So I really like using rumors and the tools to just use one sentence hooks all over the place.
I think one of the other things is that in an open world or sandbox style campaign, you have to get the players to buy in and have their own motivations and goals. And so you could accomplish this by asking all your players to create a personal quest. You can basically use the model that we do for Dungeons of Drakkenheim as well, where each player has a immediate objective that they want to achieve, and if they achieve that objective, you're going to reward them with an ability score increase or a feat. It's really important when you are designing personal quests with your players that you work with them on it, and you make sure that you tamp down on the scale of the personal quest. So, for example, a personal quest that a player has to ascend to divinity is too big for a personal quest for them to start at the beginning of the campaign. But maybe a personal quest that a player wants can be a much simpler thing. Like maybe they're playing a wizard and they just want to learn a specific spell, and finding that spell is their personal quest. Maybe another player character just wants to find the 6-fingered man and ask them about the Sword of Sins. And so make sure that the personal quests are scaled to the tier of play that you're playing in for the most part, and represent something that the characters can pursue and accomplish early enough in the campaign. And so by asking the players to come up with those hooks, you start your sandbox campaign with the players having brought several different hooks. Now, of course, you want to make sure that those hooks as well are focused in a way that the players are going to be interested in helping each other with those and have a little bit of overlap. But that player buy-in is really important to their motivation for them to getting started with that. Beyond that, I would just say is that, like, don't forget that a sandbox campaign can still have linear storylines and linear plots, and you can still have a sandbox campaign where an NPC approaches the player characters and says, "You look like a fine adventurer. I have just the quest for you." It's up to the players if they take that quest, but just because they take that quest and then they go on a very linear adventure doesn't mean that you're not still running a sandbox campaign overall, because the players might get approached by other people in the process and respond to that in an interactive way.
I also just want to add to this. There was a great comment. Where was it? It was Benjamin Burke said, have a cool map, cool names and landmarks are hooks all by themselves. And actually, one thing that we very much wanted to do for Dungeons of Drakkenheim was have visual landmarks. Behind Monty's head right now, you can see the image that we use on the DM screen for Dungeons of Drakkenheim. And when you look at that image, you already get plot hooks. Like, you want to visit the Shattered Tower. You want to visit the castle, the cathedral, the crater. This one's a little more difficult in D&D. I think this is used a lot in video games. Like, I was playing Elden Ring a lot recently. Elden Ring does a fantastic job of you walking into a new area and you get this massive landscape. And without the game telling you where to go, you go, oh, those 5 places look really interesting. But as a DM, we need to use our narration. But if you describe what the horizon looks like and the ruined castle on the edge of the cliff, or the weird smoke coming out of the mountains, you're setting up adventure hooks visually, narratively visually. But still, you can use maps, images, and your narration to inspire the characters to go to these places and see what's there.
Location, location, location.
Yeah.
Next up, the respected Madman says, how do you set up a heist for your campaign? I would love some tips on how to best design the buildings, NPCs, objectives that would help avoid non-obvious pitfalls. Okay, so I think what's cool for a heist campaign, and I think a really interesting... First of all, I'll just say, if you want to do a heist campaign, read Blades in the Dark. Like, just find the RPG Blades in the Dark, read it, and steal as much as you can from Blades in the Dark. And I think the most fundamental thing to steal for a heist campaign from Blades in the Dark is their system of clocks. When I've done a heist in the past, we did this for Rooked, for our heist, where we had clocks. We had the time limit that I could advance the time. So the player characters has 8 hours to succeed on the heist, and I could tick off the clock as they went. But then I also had the wanted level, or the alert level, very much inspired by like the Grand Theft Auto, like wanted star sort of thing. And that was how agitated the location was. And that would reflect how many enemy patrols there were, how tight security was, those two things. And I put those front and center of the players. They knew that these things were happening. And then from there, for me, for a heist, once you have those kind of meta mechanics, you really just need to devise a really cool non-linear dungeon with multiple pathways to the objective, and place as much emphasis on the getting in as the getting out. Because a heist has 2 phases, right? It has the getting in, getting into, well, I could have more, you could actually say. There's the getting in there, getting the thing, and getting out with your lives. And so remember that that's the structure that you're looking at overall.
I also think for a heist campaign, you can get a lot out of watching movies like Mission Impossible or Ocean's 11. Somebody just wrote that, or watch Ocean's 11. But one thing that's important is, I don't force this on the players, but I might nudge the question towards them of like, what are each of you specializing in for this heist? And it really lets them decide what their role is going to be in the heist. Because in Mission Impossible and Ocean's 11, you have the team. You always have the team, and there's like the hacker, the costume person, and then one of my favorite video game franchises, and I use this one as an example a lot, and this kind of goes for dungeon design in general, but I think really important for a heist. Deus Ex does this beautiful thing with its game design, where depending on how you're building your character, you can break through a wall and barge in guns blazing. You can hack the turrets and computers, or you can crawl through the ventilation shaft. there's so many viable options for how to approach the situation. So when you're designing the heist, include a guns blazing break down the door option. Include, I don't know, some secret entrances or underground sewer system that they might be able to uncover. Include outfits of the local guards that they can try to use to sneak in unseen. Or this is one of those rare cases where I love splitting the party in a heist and having people do different operations. Like one person knocks on the front door, the bard knocks on the front door and is like, I'm here to play a show. I was hired by so-and-so. And the guards are all confused. Well, and then while the guards are confused, the rogue is sneaking through the sewers to try to pop up into the courtyard. And the bard's trying to get everybody's attention. The fighter grabs a costume, puts it on, sneaks in as a guard, tries to, anyway, you get the idea.
Yeah.
The more options you present, they might not use them all, but you want to try to include so many options because then you get to watch your players have fun with how they're going to engage with the heist.
Yep. Souls the Goal wants to know, do you have any suggestions for a newer DM who has limited miniatures to keep combat encounters interesting and not just the same 10 or so guys rocking up to every combat? Thanks in advance.
I have an answer for this because my players make fun of me all the time for this. So I don't have a robust miniature collection. I mean, it's pretty robust, I guess, compared to some. But for standard guards, I have these hobgoblin minis, and they're hobgoblins, but I use them for humans. I use them for everything, and they're just red dudes with spears. They look very generic. And I use them so much.
Are those the ones that I gave you?
Yep, they were one of the first minis you gave me. Yeah.
Yep.
But one thing that's funny is so many times I put them on the board and I go, okay, guys, you're going to have to use your imagination. These are orcs. And my players go, use our imaginations in D&D? Are you kidding? And it's everybody laughs at the table because the truth is, if you have a few generic minis, it doesn't matter if you're using them over and over again. It actually has zero impact. I don't remember the minis on the table. It's awesome to have the right mini. It is.
It is.
But if you don't, you put something close to it and you tell everybody what it is, and people aren't going to remember that you had the red hobgoblin with the spear playing the orc with the axe. They're going to remember fighting an orc with an axe. And you have to remember that this is a game that uses imagination, and like people sub in Lego figures. I played a game once where it was on a piece of paper, the map was drawn, and we were using Lego figures, and we were using little Mario Kart characters. Mm-hmm. And that was how we got away with it. But like, I don't remember using those. I remember what we actually did in the game.
I'll also just say that recently Wizards of the Coast released their product called the Campaign Case. I think it's about $100, and it kind of looks like this giant box of poker chips that you can slot in a little piece of, I think it's either they call them creature clings, but basically they're pictures on paper that you could put in the tokens to represent the image of the monster that you want. And I'm pretty sure it lets you it's like reusable, and it lets you make a ton of different things. So you don't have to use real miniatures for everything. You can use a mixture of actual miniatures and tokens. You can do paper miniatures as well. Especially, this is great if you're on a budget. Like if you have a printer, you can very easily make a foldable paper mini. And there's amazing creators as well that make paper minis that you can just print and play. And like you can use a paper clip or a binder clip, and you have a cool looking miniature. And then you can use those as a supplement while you build your minis collection overall. So overall, there's options for expanding your mini collection that are quite inexpensive. They're not true miniatures, they're tokens, but they're great to use on a grid.
Yeah. The TPK DM asks, I sometimes find myself at odds with the players on how low to mid-level illusion magic is intended to work or intended to be adjudicated. What is a good method to adjudicate illusions versus how can we do it better?
Be interesting to know what exactly you're at odds about. You know what I mean? So the TPK DM, if you are in chat, it would be lovely to hear what you disagree on. My sort of common thing, I think that, but if I'm guessing, I think one of the big disagreements over illusion magic is whether or not you can detect something as an illusion simply by looking at it, right? Or whether some kind of physical investigation is required. And the rules of D&D 5e seem to imply that in many cases, using an action to take an investigation check is necessary to determine that something is an illusion. But I would say within that, it's worth remembering that if it's obvious that it's an illusion, it's obvious that it's an illusion. And you can still use your judgment there to decide what would and would not be considered an illusion. What do you think, Kelly?
I mean, I agree with that. Absolutely. It is interesting because I don't know exactly what problem we are having with illusion, but I know that illusions can be tricky just because they're very open-ended. Mm-hmm. And I try to, if there's going to be an illusion used in the game, or if a player takes an illusion spell, I actually try to have a conversation with them if they want to be an illusionist or use illusion magic. I want us to agree on the interpretation of the spell outside of the game.
Yeah.
So that there's no surprises at the table when they try to use something like minor illusion to... Well, something I did in our campaign was a minor illusion, a tarantula on somebody's cloak that was climbing up them. And a bunch of people were like, you can't make a minor illusion that moves or like moves around like that or something. And I was like, oh, I don't know. It sounded fun at the time, and Monty let me do it. But like, you have to have those give and takes on what you're going to allow and what you're going to not allow. And I think coming to an agreement between you and the DM is important.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to always ask yourself with low level illusion spells is like, in particular, I think the most egregious things happen with minor illusion and silent image. And probably the other one that's often egregious is phantasmal force. Phantasmal force is a whole other kettle of fish, though. Don't let minor illusion be the replacement for major image. Major image is a very powerful spell, and it should reward creativity. But I'm more and more on the camp that, like, yeah, minor image doesn't move. There's a limit to its size, right? There's a limit to how much it can be animated, right? And that really does put a dampener on what you can actually create with minor image, but there's still a lot of potential in that, right? So I think the biggest thing is to have a conversation with your group about how you're going to rule illusions, come to a consensus on them, and do something that works for you, that it works within your belief. But finally, my final bit of advice with illusions is don't let the players have a tendency when they use illusion magic to think that the NPCs should behave like video game NPCs and just be complete idiots about it. Like, people still have their logic and reason, even if they exist in a world of magic, right? So people can still rationalize, oh, this is weird. And even though they don't know it's an illusion, they might know that it's magic and react to it as they react to something magical. So they might think, oh, that monster that just appeared is obviously been summoned by a spellcaster. And if I kill the spellcaster, the monster will disappear. So that's the sort of thing that you could do that. So that's where I would take it.
YWBL asks, what are your thoughts on the way magic is handled in stat blocks in new books like Monsters of the Multiverse? removing spell slots, replacing spells with spell-like abilities. Should we expect Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakkenheim to use these conventions?
Okay. My first thought is finally. Like, honestly, I have long felt that doing full spell lists for NPCs is pretty pointless. It's often way more spells in a stat block than a dungeon master ever needs by a country mile. And it ends up being a lot of work to track at the table. So I do like where the new books have simplified this a little bit. I don't. I think that the NPC stat blocks having cantrip-like abilities that replace a spell-like ability is cool, and fine. I'm not a fan of the faux fireballs that are sneaking into some of the stat blocks. Just say the NPC can cast fireball. You know what I mean? Like, I think give them a cool cantrip ability that can be a little bit unique. I do like NPCs having unique abilities, and NPCs don't need to be built like player characters. So I think there's a balance, and we've tried to aim for a balance of that in Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakenheim.
My biggest issue with it, like I do think that it cleans up and streamlines gameplay for a DM, but it actually takes away from things like the use of counterspell, which, you know, some people argue is a broken option anyway, but can you counterspell a spell-like ability? Technically, no, but as a DM, I'd probably allow it because that's the way we're going with our stat blocks. So that's my biggest issue, is that it kind of makes a few relationships between like dispel magic or counterspell a little confusing.
Yeah.
So I just err on the side of like, let the players use the spell. If they took counterspell or dispel magic, let them use it.
Yeah, because as a DM, I really don't think you need to track spell slots. It's really not necessary. Like, in a lot of cases, if you look at high level NPCs, they only have one use of their high level spell, like one high level spell, one high level spell slot. So in a lot of ways, one of the other things I'll say is putting the entire spell list, the way it's formatted in the stat blocks or in the original stat blocks, it uses up a lot more page space to do it that way. But then you can do it in a much more condensed format. So there's pros. So we've kind of put our spin on it. And I think I like the way we did it.
Same. Obviously, we like the way we did it. That's why we did it. Hill Rose Red asks, what science fiction influences, if any, inspired you while you were creating the setting and story of Dungeons of Drakkenheim? It's interesting that I would say more science fiction influences are in Dungeons of Drakkenheim than there are fantasy influences.
Oh, yeah.
H.P. Lovecraft is technically eldritch horror, maybe not science fiction, but there's a lot of space monsters.
There are a lot of space monsters in Lovecraft. What else I think is really... There's a lot I could really go off. So Kelly, you start with your science fiction influences.
Well, I do think that I grew up watching things like Alien, Predator. Yeah. These might not have direct influences, but the horror themes of movies like that.
But The Thing, yeah.
The Thing is all over Drakenheim. I also want to give credit to somebody brought up the other day the video game Dead Space and asked me if I was influenced by that. And absolutely, the first Dead Space, I will say the second and third one are cool, but the first one was iconic to me. It stood out as one of the best horror video games. And the essence that it captured, the people mutating into, what were they called? Necromorphs or something. Very much, I mean, it was kind of like The Thing in space. So you can get the vibes already. It had a very Lovecraftian element to it as well. So really, any influence that I have, you can kind of trace back to H.P. Lovecraft in its influences.
Yeah. I think for me, the biggest science fiction influence on this whole thing is the Fallout series, right? Like, Fallout New Vegas is probably the touchstone of the faction conflict of Dungeons of Drakkenheim in particular. I really wanted to build this sort of complex, morally gray faction intrigue with big political undertones. I also researched a lot about meteors in real life and comets in real life, and there is a weird touchstone. I'm gonna really go deep cut with these ones, but panspermia and the berserker probes were two inspirations for the origins of the meteor in Dungeons of Drakkenheim. So warnings for spoilers for the origins of the meteor ahead, so you'll want to black out until if you don't know. I love the idea of the berserker probe. It's kind of a universal scale gray goo scenario where you get this nanobot, this machine that goes out of control, and it goes to a planet, harvests all the resource on that planet, builds more copies of itself, and then sends those probes out again. And so it's this idea of like this gray goo that spreads from planet to planet. And I just thought that was such a cool idea, and it's very like, it is very Lovecraftian in my opinion. Like this idea that it's just this out of control machine, nobody know who built it, where, like, nobody, it depends on the story, but like, who knows where it came from, who knows where it's going. There's no reason why this is happening, it's just an accident. And so for me, that is something that I kind of love about that. And I think actually you get a little bit of that in Mass Effect with the Reapers.
Mass Effect is actually another huge sci-fi influence. And again, if you look into it past the surface level, Mass Effect is a Lovecraftian story.
Yeah.
And actually another movie that I wanted to mention was Event Horizon, which is also at its core a Lovecraftian style story. So there's a lot of these elements of like great evil in the unknown that like humans can't really fathom or comprehend the power of these space essences. And it's one of my favorite sci-fi tropes, and we brought that into a fantasy world for Dungeons of Drakenheim. Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakenheim still has that, but we also look out at the larger world, so we move a little bit beyond just what Delirium is doing, but Delirium is our Lovecraftian horror.
Yeah. Great question. Yeah.
Toby Wallen asks, we're now on to some questions about the upcoming Kickstarter.
Yeah,
so
segue into Sebastian Crow's.
Toby Wallen asks, is this book going to be its own thing inside of Drakenheim, or is it going to be a part 2? Just a little confused still. So
it is not a part 2. No.
It's an expansion, but it's not an expansion that requires the first book's material. They work together. So if you own both, you're going to have a complete package. Maybe you're finishing up your Drakenheim campaign and your characters want to go beyond the scope of just the city. This book's going to help you do that. Maybe you haven't started your Drakenheim campaign yet. This book's going to add a lot more options. One thing that we say in the first book is your players need to agree to stay in the confines of the city. But if you have your hands on the second book, you can throw that out the window and say, you guys can leave if you want. Like, you're still going to have to deal with it. But if you're watching our show, we left and we came back. And you could run now with the second book, that style of campaign. Perhaps you've been watching our show and you're more interested in what's going on in Caspia or Illyria. In which case, the second book, you don't even need the first book. The second book's going to give you a bunch of adventure hooks and rumors and ideas to build campaigns everywhere in the continent. And lastly, you could buy the second book purely just because you want a bunch of new subclasses and a new class, which aren't, they're inspired by our setting, but they can be used in any setting.
I would say that Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakenheim is much closer to what you've seen in books like Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, and in particular, the Eberron books for 5th edition. So we present a bunch of new player character options that you can use, a new class, a whole bunch of new spells. Really excited about the new spells. And then there is a big gazetteer that introduces the lore of the wider world of Drakkenheim. So we have gone beyond the walls of Drakkenheim, and we're going to show you everything that this entire world has to offer. So if you don't have a copy of Dungeons of Drakkenheim, if you have no intention of running Dungeons of Drakkenheim, but you like our setting as a whole, you could run games in your setting in our setting with this book. Or you could take this book and use it to augment your Drakenheim campaign, do a follow-up campaign, anything in between. Overall, the books are meant to be complementary, but one book does not require the other at all.
Good question. Hope that answers it. So yeah, get the second book, whether or not you have the first one. Gatsby MN asks, hello dudes, just curious, but will Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakenheim include a new adventure or suggestions on how to continue finished Dungeons of Drakenheim adventures in the greater world? What I'll say is we might have some stretch goals for specific adventures, some of which you saw in Shadows. However, this book is not meant to be an adventure book. What it does do is it gives a lot of inspiration, and I think personally, it gives a lot of tools for any DM who's ever homebrewed anything to be able to make campaigns, adventures, or plots in our world. They're less so specific adventure sites, but it details the cities, the problems, what's going on politically, magically, religiously, and all of the little nitty-gritty details. There's epic monsters hiding in the corners of this book that you'll find in certain locations. There are political intrigues and secret wars and cults and all sorts of stuff happening below the surface that any DM who wants to expand on the Drakenheim campaign will find inspiration to do so. Does it include specifics? Not really, but it includes a ton of information. For myself, when I'm reading over the book that we wrote, every sentence gives me an idea for an entire adventure that I could run in the world of Drakenheim.
So I would say that overall, like, we don't write it. It's not written as if it's an adventure where we go into detail on encounter by encounter. Like, here is this castle, here's what's in the castle, here's the things that you can fight, here's the adventure hooks. But what we do give you are, here's the major NPCs that are the political players in the world. Here's some problems that this region is encountering. Here's some cities and interesting locations and an idea of like what kind of monsters live there or what kind of people or things are going on there. So you'll be able to build your own adventures. It'll be very DIY in that respect. And then from there, we're hoping to hit some stretch goals so that we can do some added adventure content in some way. Unfortunately, those might have to be extras because we totally hit. We have a lot of stretch goals planned to add content onto the book, and an adventure adds a lot of content to the book, more than we could probably, even if we max out our word count and what we can print in the physical book. So we'll see what options we explore there for actual adventures, because we want to do more adventures in the world of Drakenheim. But the other thing I should say with this is that this book is written with players and dungeon masters in mind. So we didn't want to include any content in this book that would spoil anything for a player, whether that player is playing another adventure in the world of Drakenheim or playing Dungeons of Drakenheim as well. So there's a player who reads the whole lore section might know a lot about the world and the people that live there, but they're not going to get any big mysteries spoiled for them.
Yeah, I noticed David Kelnins asked that in chat, and I think that's an important question to answer is yes, this book is meant for players to read through. Even the lore section is also intended for players who want to create characters that are deeply embedded in our world, to read the lore, decide where their character might come from, what their personal goals are, what they're fighting for, why they're going to Drakenheim. All of that and more can be explored in this. So we tried to write this book from a historical standpoint. It's kind of like we talk about the history of the world, but the history of the world in terms of what most people who maybe spent some time reading the history of the world or researching it would have found out. We try not to spoil too many of the big secrets. Those are saved. If you bought Dungeons of Drakkenheim, you're going to know some of the big secrets about Drakenheim. And maybe in future projects we'll reveal more big secrets. But this is a book meant for DMs and players to both be able to read front to back. And I think it was also mentioned here, I think the only big spoiler is if you wanted to keep the Academy Directorate secret, they are mentioned in this book and they are named, although not all of their locations are fully fleshed out, and there are some secrets that we allude to without revealing.
So we actually didn't get a name for whoever submitted this question, but they wanted to know, how different was your experience writing the second book compared to the first?
Very, actually. The difference between a setting book and a adventure book is wild. And I think one thing that happened with this second book is the first book was entirely based on our first season of Dungeons of Drakenheim. And therefore, we got to work off of what had already been established, what already existed, and we got to flesh that out. In this second book, we were going into unmarked territory. We knew enough about Caspian Illyria to flesh that out, but then we realized that there were more nations on the continent, and we had never even mentioned them before. And so suddenly the lore section of this book exploded with new details, new types of people, their worlds and their lands and their wars and their history. And it was really, really interesting, but a little more daunting. I think as we got to the lore section was the most daunting thing I ever wrote. Yeah. Because we had nothing to go on. It was just like a wide expanse of nothingness that we had to fill with information. So it was really exciting and terrifying. And I remember there was a moment where Monty and I were like, oh boy, I don't think we're going to hit our minimum word count. And then all of a sudden we started filling those pages and we were like, oh, we are at our maximum word count. We need to dial back a few ideas here.
The other thing that's different with this book is that we are developing new player content and a new class and new spells. So there's been a lot more playtesting happening with this book, and there's going to be a lot more playtesting happening with this book. So for all of our new player options, we're really excited because in the fall, after the Kickstarter, from probably October to December, we're going to do the first 2 phases of our playtest with all backers. So you're going to be able to help us do the final polish and the final playtesting of all the player focused content, so we can really make sure that this stuff is well balanced, really well developed, and is ready to go at many tables. And if you want to use the playtest material in your games very soon, you will be able to do that too. So that development element of it was very different in this process, because whereas before, as Kelly said, we were just translating our original adventure, which we had run, into a module, whereas with this one we're developing brand new content and we're developing player content that requires playtesting. So it was really fun. It was amazing how fast we learned we had to change things once we started the playtesting games.
Yeah, there's the playtesting period is going to be intense, and I'm very excited to see. I'm very excited to see how powerful we made our subclasses and if they were too powerful. Yeah. Which brings us to our next question. R. Johnson 117. How many new subclasses are there, if any? And what is the general theme of them collectively? What was your goal with adding subclasses to Drakenheim? There are going to be 12 subclasses at least. Hopefully a few more in stretch goals. We'll see.
One for every class in the 5e core rules. Yep.
As well, we have a new class which is going to be introduced with 3 of its own subclasses. The general theme, in my opinion, is equal parts tied to the lore that you know of the world of Drakenheim already, and us creating subclasses that we always wanted to see for certain classes and tying them to the overall world lore. So what I mean by that is you're going to see some subclasses that are tied directly to contamination, the haze, Drakkenheim, and that sort of vibe. Well, other subclasses are tied to religious beliefs or political options and kind of inform the world of Drakenheim as well. Each subclass has its own little section that talks about how that class overall fits into our world. In some cases, we took things like, well, what was Pluto Jackson in our show trying to represent with his fighter? And can we make a subclass that feels like that? What was Veo Senya or the Hooded Lanterns trying to represent as a ranger? Can we make a subclass that speaks to that? Was Kelly playing too much God of War when he was writing his barbarian subclass? Probably. So it's going to be a little mix of everything, but we've tied everything directly to the lore in our world.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that they all have a collective theme aside from being subclasses that feel like they're very at home in the world of Drakenheim. But in some cases, we made subclasses where we're like, you know what? This is just a general fantasy that we would love to be able to realize in 5th edition. Like, we think this would be cool. And to be perfectly honest, you don't need any other justification for creating a new class or subclass other than I think it's cool. Like, you don't. That is the only reason ever. Because that's the only reason why we do anything for D&D, is because we think it's cool. So in a lot of cases, Kelly and I are just like, we thought these would be cool and people would like them and enjoy playing with them in their games. And we like them and we want to play them. And so we hope that you do too. So there's kind of a process that comes from all over the place. I think for me, the overall goal was to just, and I would also say my kind of secret goal was like, I wanted to do it. Like, I wanted to do a subclass for every class. Because we did do them before for the Grim Hollow Player's Guide, and it was a lot of fun to make them. And so making things is just something that we like doing. Right, so it's kind of like our goal was to make one for every class because we thought that would be cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we both have some favorites, and somebody did ask about monk subclasses, and yes, Monty and I are trying to make a monk that, specifically a monk that Monty would play, because I like monks, but we tried to make a monk that Monty would enjoy playing. Dank Snail asks, how many of the new feats and spells would be usable / make sense outside of the world of Drakenheim? Are they mostly setting agnostic with the exception of contaminated spells, or are they mostly tied into the setting? This one's a pretty easy answer. The spells and tool feats are available to everybody everywhere. They are designed, the spell list in particular is designed with the Apothecary in mind, but those spells are available to many other, like all spellcasting classes have access to some arrangement of the new spells. Obviously, the contaminated spells are much more tied to Drakenheim, and the tool feats are not really tied to Drakenheim. We just wanted to put them in this book because we think that tools should be more useful, and in a campaign like Drakenheim, you might end up with some downtime or some things to do with your tools. So being able to award tool feats or proficiencies in an open world setting where you have a lot of downtime for you to explore what tools mean in your game, we thought that was something really interesting that was needed in D&D. So we tucked it into this book, but it's not so much Drakenheim specific as it is just Monty and Kelly wanted to make D&D better for everybody.
And okay, any of the subclasses will work in your own setting if you're not playing Drakenheim. The only thing that we found is if you want to use the contaminated classes and spells, the subclasses that interact with contamination. So the Malfeasant Wizard is one of them, and the Circle of Contamination Druid is another. You just need to be aware that the contamination mechanic is designed to be a long-term problem that players encounter. So if you're going to allow players outside of a Drakkenheim campaigns to use the contaminated player options, you have to make sure that they face foes that will, or situations where they will face contamination as well, because contamination is meant to be a gamble. When a player character is the only one using contaminated magic, the result is that they are a little bit more powerful than they would normally be, because they don't have to face the threat of something else contaminating them and them turning into a monster. So we kind of leave this as a disclaimer to say that, like, if you are running outside Drakenheim, you want to make sure that if you're allowing those options, that you make sure that contamination is present in your campaign. You could use contamination outside Drakenheim. Like, you don't have to have it tied to delirium in the haze. It can reflect a whole bunch of weird magic that happens in your setting. So you can port that whole... In fact, I've spoken to a lot of people who have used contamination in different ways in their own settings. So it's just, you got to take contamination with the contamination mechanic for the contaminated classes and spells.
Yeah, I think there's 2, maybe 3 subclasses that are directly tied to contamination. So other than that, though, everything's pretty open.
The Delirium Soul Sorcerer is the other.
The Delirium Soul Sorcerer, the Malfeasant Wizard, and we may or may not have a stretch goal of another one. Actually, another 2? There might be 4.
No, I don't think the Warlock subclasses actually interact with contamination.
I was thinking Druid. Did we end up doing the Druid?
There's a Druid, and there is a contaminated Barbarian.
Yeah. So we'll see. There might be upwards of 4, but some of those are stretch goals. So you're still getting a whole bunch of subclasses that will be fully available.
Speaking of which, Karian asks, if my characters are wanting to switch to their new subclasses you guys will be releasing, should I allow it, especially if it's in the middle of a Drakenheim campaign? And if so, how could I go about in a good manner that would make sense? My answer is yes, you should allow it. You should allow your players to retrain. You can just use the immediate retraining rules that are in Tasha's. They're in Tasha's or Xanathar's. And then just build a story. Like, you don't need to overthink it. Just have a conversation about it if you want to make it part of the story, or you can just allow it. But yeah, go ahead. Start using them. Don't hold back.
Especially, I would say, the ones that we just mentioned, the contaminated character options.
Yeah.
If one of your players gets contamination poisoning and they're playing a shadow sorcerer, having them become a delirium soul sorcerer is iconic. If they're studying the contaminated magic as a wizard, becoming a Malfeasant Wizard is awesome. If they're a barbarian who is running into the haze constantly and battling monsters, like, there are a lot of options there. And really, like, our fighter and ranger subclass are actually very suiting the fighter subclass. If they end up uniting with the Caspians, the Illyrians, or like some military force, they might end up switching over to the fighter subclass. If they join the Hooded Lanterns, it makes a lot of sense if they're a ranger to become our ranger subclass. So there's a lot of story options that you can actually tug on to, like, basically say they get trained by a group of people in our setting and become this.
Yep. Afton says, you guys have said that you looked at subclasses for all the base classes. Does that mean there will be no subclass option for the Artificer in your book? Sadly, there will not. The Artificer is not in the system reference document and is thus not in the OGL, so the book will not have an Artificer subclass. Very sorry.
We would love to make one. I gotta tell you, I have a bunch of ideas for one, but we cannot publish material for the Artificer. Hopefully at some point Wizards of the Coast says, yeah, you can, but until they do, we're not allowed to put it in a book, and we'd love to. And I don't know. We'll see. We'll see if we can say something someday about the Artificer, because I'm sure Monty and I both would love to.
Dyson Doggo. Oh, go ahead, Kelly. You read it. Yep.
Dyson Doggos asks, "What's the process you go through to contaminate a spell? How could I create my own?" Great question. When we contaminate spells, it's actually a pretty simple and fun process.
Yes, it is.
You take a spell that already exists. you make it give the character a level of contamination, and then you dial it up to 11 so that it's worth the cost, maybe. It's a lot of fun to ask the question of, like, what does this spell dialed up to 11? And obviously you don't want to go too crazy with it. So when I say dial it up to 11, you're really kind of making a first level spell act like a second level spell, or a second level spell act like a third level spell, and so forth from there. And just ask yourself, what's the coolest version of what this spell normally does? Mm-hmm. But what if we made it do something a little bit cooler? For example, our what did we call it? The contaminated witch bolt. I forget what we named it all of a sudden, but it was in the first book.
Warp Bolt, I think.
Warp Bolt. Okay. Warp Bolt was really, we mentioned that we don't love some of the components of Witch Bolt in general. So that was a really fun one because we got to say, well, what don't we like about Witch Bolt? Well, we wish it had better range. We wish it did X, Y, and Z. So then we just made a version of the spell that did that, added a contamination level, and there you go.
Yeah. Yeah. So the kind of the other thing with the contaminated spells is it's also a fun opportunity to go a little bit insane and add some cool, like, boost the damage up, change the damage type to necrotic, poison, psychic, acid, or even force damage. So we steered away from, like, fire damage. Sometimes we do lightning damage with contaminated spells. Sometimes. And so then you can also add a really crazy effect. Also, contaminated spells can cause contamination. So that's another basic baseline, is you can take an like, that was how we did Conjure the Deep Haze. Conjure the Deep Haze was, what if Cloud Kill contaminated people? So, yeah, right? We have a new spell coming, which is Conjure Delirium Elemental. It's, what if Conjure Elemental summoned a contaminated elemental instead. So often you can just ask it's a very simple question to ask, but it does boost it up a little bit in a cool way.
Magnus Prime asks, what was the fantasy you wanted this class to fulfill when designing it? This is a question specifically about the Apothecary class that we are releasing. If you haven't heard about it yet, the Apothecary is a new class that we are introducing in Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakenheim. They are an intelligence-based spellcaster that combines occult lore and medical knowledge to fuel their spells and magical abilities. They can harm their foes or heal their allies, and we have 3 cool subclasses that kind of give them different vibes to go with. I'm very excited about the Apothecary. I think that the fantasy, which is the first thing that Monty and I sat down with, is, first of all, the idea of the occult doctor. This is very common we've talked about our influences. Sci-fi and H.P. Lovecraft was a big influence. You're going to notice that in almost every H.P. Lovecraft story, the narrator or one of the prominent characters is some sort of scientist, investigator, doctor, who's in over their head with occult findings. And we thought, what if that was a fantasy character? We take inspiration from famous tropes like Victor Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, and even really fun ideas like Dana Scully from The X-Files, who is a doctor who's also an investigator.
A paranormal investigator.
That's important. She investigates the paranormal. So we take these sort of vibes and we really wanted to capture that. What does it mean to be a fantasy version of that character? So in this way, spellcasting for the Apothecary is a little less magical and a little more science.
Yeah. And I think another, so Josh David asked really quickly, it is a full caster in the same way that a warlock is a full caster. So we riff on the warlock spellcasting mechanics for the Apothecary. We're doing something very bold and giving them more spell slots than the warlock gets. And we are also giving them lots of customization options. They're intelligence based, and the subclasses really transform the base class in a big way. So one of the big original inspirations, of course, as Kelly mentioned, is Victor Frankenstein. So you will be able to be Victor Frankenstein making their creature out of body parts and make your corpse rock creature. That's
The
one of the
Reanimator.
that's the Reanimator. That's one of the subclasses. The other big influence was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where you create a potion, you drink it, and you transform into a hulking mutated beast. That's the mutagenist. And one of the cool things that we actually love about the mutagenist is we realized as we were building it, we're like, oh, this is Bruce Banner and the Hulk.
Yeah, Bruce Banner and the Hulk is really just Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde turned into a comic book. So yeah, if you wanted to play the Hulk in D&D, the mutagenist is the way to go. My favorite mechanic that we made for the mutagenist is when you transform, your strength and intelligence modifiers or scores get switched.
Yeah.
So you lose intelligence, gain strength. It's going to be really, really fun. The final core subclass that we're introducing with the Apothecary, this is the one that to me feels like a double dose of Apothecary, is the Pathogenist. And the Pathogenist is the master of disease, poison, and acid. They can add mutant strains to their disease spells or poison spells so that they can reshape the way they use magic to do more harm or select more targets. And they kind of get to customize how they influence specific types of magic that the Apothecary gets.
And watch out, paladins, because pathogenists' diseases will affect you. And watch out.
They have an ability.
Yeah, and watch out, undead and constructs, because the pathogenists are coming for you too. So we really wanted to the pathogenist really is like, how do we make poisons in diseases work in an interesting way, even though the game often gives so many immunities to these sorts of things on the monster side of it. So it's pretty cool. We had the pathogenist was where we're like, oh, we need to make more spells because contagion is not enough. So we have some low level spells that cause disease. And cause sickness and stuff like that, and that the pathogenist can spread around. There will be multi-classing rules, but you're probably not going to want to multi-class the Apothecary because we've kind of designed it to discourage you from multi-classing the Apothecary by making the high-level abilities really good. It's not as front-loaded. I would say the Apothecary is not a good class to dip. It's definitely one that you want to take pretty far.
I could see dipping into other classes, like if you dipped Artificer and then went Apothecary, or dipped Wizard and went Apothecary, maybe. But we tried to design it. Yes, there will be the option to multiclass, and I guarantee a bunch of people out there are going to find stuff that we didn't think of for multiclassing. But we tried to design it with that in mind, that we wanted people to read the class and go, I want to be a full Apothecary.
I think the only one that is possibly scary is we have a sub-theme with the Apothecary of like the Scalpel Discipline Apothecary that uses blades and is good in melee. And so you can build your Apothecary to like have surgical strikes and extra attack and credit, and like you can build a melee Apothecary, which is pretty cool. And it might be OP if you multi-class that with Bladesinger, but I feel like in order for you for that build to work, you'd need to be a level 12 character. You need 6 levels of Bladesinger and at least 6 levels of Apothecary, and I think for a level 12 character it's fine. I think it's fine. Yeah.
The next question from D20 Doc: what party role or roles is the Apothecary best suited to fill? What's really interesting about our design principle on the Apothecary is that the subclasses each steer the Apothecary in a different direction. On top of that, we have over 40 what we call esoteric theories, which are extremely customizable options. So you can really build an Apothecary to fill whatever role you choose. However, well, on most of the roles, I'll say, most of them. However, the core Apothecary, I would say, is a support, utility, battlefield controller, and a nudge into damage dealer.
Yeah, you can build an amazing healer with the Apothecary. That was one of the early design goals. We wanted an amazing intelligence-based healer. If you want to be your party healer and you don't want to sign up as a cleric or a druid because you don't want like the religious element of the character, the Apothecary is your total jam. Like, you really can, yeah.
And we might have a stretch goal subclass that pushes you even further in that direction, but we're not going to reveal that yet. So I do think what's really cool is, for example, an Apothecary wouldn't be labeled as a tank or frontliner. But if you take the Mutagenist, you can be. An Apothecary might not get labeled as the Negotiator, and I actually think that's the one that... it's going to be hard. Their charisma has no real place on the Apothecary. You're too sciencey for that.
We do have an esoteric theory called bedside manner that gives you proficiency in persuasion and insight.
So there you go. You might be able to build, but you're never the reliable negotiator, I'd say, with the Apothecary. But they fill a lot of roles, but our middle line is utility and support, I would say.
Yeah.
With several of the subclasses pushing into damage dealing. And you'll find, hopefully, if we hit all of our stretch goals, there's going to be a lot of options.
A-Lot wants to know, will the book add more to NPCs from the Drakenheim adventure? For example, do you think some NPCs should be one of the Drakenheim subclasses? How can DMs use the book without making Dungeons of Drakenheim campaigns too bulky? So, okay. This kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, but it's a multi-barreled question here. The book has stuff that you could pluck and drop into Dungeons of Drakenheim as you want to, but it doesn't really give you anything that's going to make the campaign longer or shorter. It might give you more things to help your player characters build characters that are more connected to the world. It might help them with their personal quests. And you could certainly bring some of the NPCs that we talk about in the setting into your adventure. So for example, I think two NPCs that people are going to really love that are detailed in Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakenheim that you might want to bring in are the Divine Matriarch and High Paladin Uriel Radley, as well as the directors of the Amethyst Academy, who weren't detailed in Dungeons of Drakenheim. They don't need to be a factor in the Dungeons of Drakenheim campaign, but if you want to take the campaign to that global level, you can. So really, in a lot of ways, I think it's taking the campaign, like, it's more setting you up if you want to take Drakenheim and continue the adventure after you've finished it, rather than giving you things that you would actually add to what's already in Drakenheim.
Although I do think there are options if you wanted to do that. Yep. But yeah. Wallen asks, any more stretch goals? Yes, we have lots. I think that what stretch goals can we talk about? Well, we've mentioned, okay, so we have a bunch of additional subclasses, several for the Apothecary and several for other classes that may get added as additional stretch goals. We have possible adventures for DMs to run that are stretch goals. I think we have a stretch goal for another video series where we might dissect some of the Apothecary options.
There's a lot of extra content. So there's more subclasses, more spells, and more NPC stat blocks for ready-made NPCs as well. So more of everything. Most of the stretch goals are adding more content to the book, increasing its overall length. I think the stretch goals really add a lot of page count to the book.
I think, did we write more for this second book than for the first book?
About as much in total, yeah.
Yeah.
About as much. And so, yeah, and then we have some of the stretch goals will be for new products and add-ons. But for the most part, we try to keep the stretch goals add more to the book. So every backer, whether you get the PDF or the top tier, can get can get in on it, because it's adding more value for everyone that backs the project.
Brian asks, are there any thoughts about getting compatibility for VTTs like Fantasy Grounds? Speaking of stretch goals,
you will be both happy and disappointed. That's all I can say about that.
I think they'll be happier than disappointed.
We'll find out.
We'll find out.
We'll find out. Yeah.
We'll have news on Monday.
Brian, your question specifically, you will be happy and disappointed with what the answer to that question is. Hopefully we'll find out on Monday.
So many people in chat are talking about the plushies, and
yeah,
I don't think I realized how much, like, plushies are usually such a gamble. They're the least useful item in our entire.
You know what the problem is, though? Unfortunately,
they're adorable.
They're adorable, but the plushie added so much shipping volume.
Yeah.
Right, because it was this. It's a big squishy plushie. So it basically doubled the size of the package for the Executioner's tier. Which unfortunately we're very cognizant of shipping problems now, because the problems continue to persist, and so we want that was, I think, part of the reason why we're not doing a plushie this time around, because we're kind of worried about packaging that thing. Yeah.
Sorry, I wanted a Bruce plushie too. We all did, but.
Yeah.
It was tough. We're doing what we can. Instead, you get more subclasses. I hope that's better than a plushie. I hope. Robbed asks, will you be offering all new products, accessories, or will there also be some past hits re-released from the first Kickstarter? If only new stuff, could those past items people missed from the Kickstarter be add-ons this time around? I'll say yes. They can be add-ons this time around.
And yes, there will be new things.
And yes, there will be new things.
Yeah.
We have a bunch of new products. If you're in our Discord, you may have seen a sneak peek of some of the upcoming products. If you're not on our Discord, now's a great time for me to plug it. You want a sneak peek of some of the stuff coming out? Hop on our Discord, which is for our patrons.
Or on our Patreon. It's on our Patreon page.
Or on our Patreon, which you need to be on the Patreon to go on our Discord. But yeah, there will be add-ons, and you'll be able to add on some of the items from the first Kickstarter. I'm sorry, I read this person's name and started laughing. Pickle Surprise asks, what events does this book assume have happened in Drakkenheim? Anything from the show? Anything from the main campaign? Or is it meant to be consumed in tandem with no assumption of events outside those prior to the campaign? This book, again, is Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakkenheim is written with the assumption, I think there's only like 3 to 4 assumptions. Generally, the meteors hit where we started the first campaign. All of the history of the world is in this book. The only assumptions are obviously that Sebastian Crow and his fellow friends have survived, because he's the one narrating this book. So he's alive and he has traveled the world a little bit and he has a lot to say. The other assumption in this book, without giving too much away, is that the Duchess didn't die in your Dungeons of Drakkenheim campaign. And I think that's one of and escaped Drakenheim. Are there any other?
Yeah. Overall, the basic assumption is that the events of the show never happened. Or yes, that's the basic assumption, right? Is the show is completely non-canonical with regards to the book. So you can run the world of Drakenheim and Dungeons of Drakenheim as if Sebastian, Pluto, and Bayo simply do not exist.
Except that Sebastian's on the cover.
But Sebastian's on the cover of the book, but the actual content of the book doesn't. doesn't require that Sebastian even exists.
No, he's an omnipotent figure who is telling you about the different things in the world.
It's not, and it's not written in the first person style. It's written in the, here's Sebastian giving fun quips and comments. Yeah.
It's like Xanathar's or Tasha's, where it's a functional book, but you'll see little post-its throughout the book with Sebastian giving his 2 cents on things, which are probably, don't listen to his 2 cents on any topic, because he's very biased and opinionated.
Spectre, the Kickstarter starts on Monday.
Yes, coming this Monday.
Yeah.
Paladin Pariah asks, what naming conventions do you use for Drakenheim? You seem to have named things from sources as varied as medieval histories to 60s rock stars. Is there a method to this, or do you just name things as they come to you? Monty?
Westmar is vaguely Germanic. I have had many native German speakers criticize me very harshly on my bastardized use of German words, and I am unrepentant on that. I will continue to do so, and you can't stop me.
Yeah, okay, actually, Monty, I was reading an article today about the butchering of language in the sense that people use terms like ATM machine. There's other examples, but that's the one that's sticking out, where ATM stands for automatic teller machine. So you're saying automatic teller machine. And I instantly, they were like, this happens all the time in the English language. They gave like 20 examples. And my first thought was like, so of course they would name a forest Ochtenwald Forest, which stands for Danger Forest, because that's what we do with language. It's not wrong. It's actually correct in the way that the world works.
Yeah. But overall, yes, my apologies to native German speakers. My PhD supervisor is originally East German. And we have I've heard quite the earful already about my use of bastardized German. So the beyond that, Caspia has a little bit of a Greco-Roman planet name theme to it, and Illyria has a little bit of what's called American aristocracy naming conventions used. So it uses a lot of names like that you often saw in this like names like Theodore and Ophelia, and you would often see used in this American aristocracy sort of way, because it then contrasts like Theodore and Ophelia with names like Marshall and stuff like that. Other regions of the world go a little bit more classic fantasy in their naming conventions, and so that's sort of the modus operandi that we take with that. And yeah, as you can no doubt tell, we really like Easter eggs and pop culture references, and we try to do it in a mostly tasteful way. But I like jokes, and I like deep cuts to literary references, so those are all gonna get in there.
If you caught the 100 in the first book, get ready for 100 more in this book. We got references to everything. Probably one of my favorite moments. Actually, something that's definitely present in both Dungeons of Drakkenheim and this new book in terms of Easter eggs is if you happen to be from Toronto or know about Toronto, we throw a lot of Toronto Easter eggs into our setting. And probably one of my favorite moments is I designed a location in this new book. And Monty messages me, I think after we were about to submit the manuscript. And you were like, Kelly, I don't know if you noticed, but this location is the CN Tower in Skydome. Was that intentional? And I was like, oh yeah, that was intentional. It's the CN Tower in Skydome. They're there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love doing that stuff. We love throwing in our little nods to our home. ON asks, in the long term, do you think you'll stay married to the world of Drakenheim, gradually fleshing more and more of it out over time? Or is the world of Drakenheim just the first stop on your career and you'll move on to new things? This has been a question that has been torturing Monty and I, because I think the answer is we want to do both.
Yeah.
And we're trying to figure out when to do both. I have so many Drakenheim stories to tell, but I know Monty has another continent or another world or multiple other worlds.
Yeah.
stirring around in his head.
I mean, Kelly and I are having a big debate about this because another dream that Kelly and I kind of have is we kind of want to do a miniature skirmish game, and we're having a back and forth right now over whether it should be a Drakenheim set in the world of Drakkenheim or set in a new world and a new setting. So that's kind of that's one of the things that we're sort of toying around with.
Don't open that can of worms, man. That's
I think I would I want to obviously. I remember also as well, Kelly, having a conversation a while ago where I was like, yeah, we'll finish Drakkenheim and move on to the next thing. And you were like, no, don't. And so I feel like with Drakenheim, we'll continue playing in the world of Drakkenheim, but go tell other stories in the world that go off in different places and expand this world in interesting ways. And leave Drakenheim kind of stopped in time, right? I don't think we're gonna. I don't really think that beyond the show we're gonna like advance the canon. Do you?
I think that once season 3 is done, this era, this story is finished. We won't return to these characters. We probably won't even return to the city of Drakkenheim. We might visit other locations that have been mentioned, but. For example, people who are in our Discord know very well that I have an entire Dwarven Underdark. We don't call it the Underdark, but I have an entire Dwarven Underdark campaign brewing that Monty and I have already thrown around ideas for. Also, like, I want to make a Tomb of Horrors. No, not Tomb of Horrors. Tomb of Annihilation style campaign through the jungles of Terrene. And like we have all of these locations now to explore world-spanning ideas, and we've hinted at other things happening elsewhere in the world. So we could go to an entire new continent and start building even further out, creating a whole world map of the setting. And what's happening on another continent could be vastly different than what's happening on this one.
At the same time, I also really want to do like a heavy metal ultraviolet grassland spelljammer riff. I really want to do something psychedelic and trippy and like something that feels like it's set on Mars with like space fantasy. Like I love the spelljammer stuff coming out, but like I really want to do a much more 80s acid wash psychedelic heavy metal take on space fantasy. Yeah.
And I'm gonna bring my Neon Knight Rider cyberpunk, but in can you do cyberpunk fantasy?
Yes,
we're gonna do cyberpunk fantasy.
Cyberpunk fantasy is Shadowrun.
Well, we're gonna do it.
Have you not like been exposed to Shadowrun fully?
Okay, so actually the funny thing, do you remember when we were in line at Gen Con and I pointed to the thing and I was like, whatever this is looks amazing. And then we got into the con and you were like, oh, it was Shadowrun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been exposed to Shadowrun. I've never played it. But I love everything about the cyberpunk setting except the video game Cyberpunk. Which I wish was better. But I love cyberpunk, and I think cyberpunk fantasy is really, really cool. And so Monty and I have this itch that, like, I think you're bringing your, like, heavy metal inspiration, and I'm bringing my cyberpunk inspiration. You're going to bring, like, Acid Wash. I'm going to bring Neon Knight Rider. We're going to collide. So someday Monty and I want to do
I think that those might be two different things.
I think they pair together.
I think I would rather do them as two different things.
Well, now we have two different settings.
Yeah, but that's fine.
Oh, it's so much work.
Yeah, but that's but isn't that better? Like,
well,
I would rather make a world that is true to the nugget of its, like, that's true to itself than try to like, but maybe there is something in smashing those things together. I don't know. I like.
Somebody in the comments wrote rock and roll is better than heavy metal, and I'm pretty sure Monty, when he talks about heavy metal, I know he has told me probably at least 1,000 times now to watch rock and roll on our friendship, and I still haven't. Yeah. So I'm sorry, Monty, I will be watching rock and roll, but Yeah, rock and roll, heavy metal. I want to bring like Labyrinth vibes in there, like all the 80s. I
Yeah, okay. I'll say I think I don't want to do all the 80s though. I
well,
want to.
fine.
Okay, I don't want to do all the 80s in one project. I want to do. For me, there is definitely this labyrinth, never-ending story, 80s fantasy.
Yeah.
But mixing that with rock and roll and heavy metal, those are different projects for sure.
Well, unfortunately,
Labyrinth, David Bowie does. I see where David Bowie bridges that gap, right?
and
Yeah.
Monty, unfortunately, the only choice you have is I've never watched heavy metal or rock and roll. Sorry, chat. Sorry, everybody. I apologize. So when I jump in as an additional writer on this project, you're going to get whatever I have, and that's going to be part of it.
We will have to partake of libations and watch these films.
I accept. It's been a long time coming for me. So, Dark Crystal and Willow. Those are so good.
Oh, yeah. But yes, totally.
Dark Crystal is incredible. If you haven't watched the series is it still on Netflix? I hope so. I really wanted a season 2. That was like one of my favorite shows. It was horrifyingly dark. And I love horrifyingly dark.
Also, like, I could also double down on something really Irish. Like, really, like, pre-Christian Ireland. Because we started doing that with the Isle of Skye, but I would love to just do a whole, like... You know how we've done, like... We've seen Greek mythology with Theros, right?
Mm-hmm.
I really think that a mythological Celtic / Viking would be really cool. So like not like realist, like really lean into the mythological where like the gods walk the earth, the gods are real, like go hard on the Norse mythology, go hard on the Celtic mythology, go hard on the Irish mythology. And again, I'm talking like pre-Christian versions of these stories. And really go there, and like with a heavy dose of the Northmen. Yeah,
which I loved. Like Northman vibes would be really cool. So I'd be on board. I'm on board with all these ideas. Yeah. Plus, on top of that, we have a million more Drakkenheim stories. So I guess the answer to that last question is expect Monty and Kelly to never stop coming up with ideas, because we're idea people and we have a million stories to tell in a million different settings. And I mean, I pitched to Monty an entire dreamscape campaign that was like, I don't know, it was wild, some sort of trippy dream campaign that we almost were talking about doing. But I think that one would probably pair better with my Labyrinth neon cyber setting in Dreamland. But I also want to do dwarves. I want to do jungle adventures. I want to do everything. I want to hit every single possible market in D&D before I'm done.
Yeah.
Questions from the chat. Yeah. Do you want to start that?
Yeah, let's do that. So, I didn't get the name of who asked this. It was, how long has the whole Drakenheim process been? Which is so we started working on it really in 2017 when we started the Dungeon Dudes channel, when we knew we wanted to do a live stream.
I'm going to go back even further than that. You know, Drakenheim specifically was, I'd say, inspired by multiple campaigns that you and I collaborated on to run for our gang. There was the city campaign, we called it.
Yeah.
And the city campaign, I think, was the origin of what would become Drakkenheim. Mm-hmm. And that was 2014, 2015?
Probably. But in terms of like the book phase of Drakkenheim,
right.
Each book has been about a year's worth of development time, including like all the project conception phases and writing and everything like that. The only exception to that being with Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakenheim, we actually started developing the Apothecary years ago. and started making the Apothecary several years ago, and we were looking for an opportunity to bring it out. Because I think we started working on that like maybe even before we started Drakkenheim streams.
Yeah, it was early in the Dungeon Dudes. Like, it was right after we released our treasure trove on the DMs Guild.
Yeah.
And then we were like, could we do a class? And we started brainstorming the Apothecary. And originally it was going to be designed to be released on the DMs Guild. Luckily, we didn't do that because now it's getting the full fantastic treatment and going to be published in a book, which in my opinion is way cooler. So yeah, Drakenheim's been happening for a long time. The Apothecary has been in development for a long time, and yeah. The Rising Ape asks, "Hey fellas, first time catching you live. Mrs. Ape expressed interest during my last D&D session, so I'm getting the new starter for us. So what's your number one piece of advice for a first-time DM?" My number one piece of advice for a first-time DM is don't over-prep, listen to your players, and you're there to have fun too. I think what's so important, and it took me a long time to learn this, and it takes every DM, I think, a long time to learn this. I have the most fun DMing where instead of being beholden to a structure that I think I've laid out, I have a loose idea on where I want the adventure to go for the evening. I have some notes written down. Know your monsters, know their motives, know the location, but then listen to your players and respond to them instead of trying to force them into situations. Being a responsive DM that gets excited about your players' shenanigans and joins in on those shenanigans is going to get you a lot further than trying to force players to do what you want them to do.
I think my number one piece of advice for a first-time dungeon master is take a measured scope for your first campaign. And so that's what and by measured scope I mean don't set an expectation from the start that you're going to run a multi-year long epic campaign. Just run the starter set and see how it goes. And hand in hand with that, limit yourself to 4 players tops. 4 players. No more, no less. 4. That way, it will be a very focused experience for you. And then after you finish running the starter set, reflect on the experience and see how it went. And then think about whether you want to start running another written campaign or start writing your own. But run the starter set adventure first and talk with your group and see how you feel and reflect back on how it went. Start small. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm a first-time DM. How long should you intro your new party for a healthy and easy start in the first session? I think it's very important to run a session 0 where you just...
And if you're a first-time DM, check out our video on running a session 0 that's on YouTube.
Yes. Yeah. Session 0 is where you're not even going to be playing the game. You're just introducing everybody. You might play what I call the goblin or the orcish pie, and I'll get to that in a second. But if you're a first-time DM running it for first-time players, run a session 0, have everybody make their characters, and sort of just talk about the vibe of the small campaign you're going to run. As Monty just said, if you're a first-timer, don't jump into a multi-year campaign. Run the starter set. Lost Mine of Fendelver is perfect. Talk to your players about expectations, what you think is going to happen in that campaign. And then if you're brand new to the game, I run a scenario that Monty ran for me when he was introducing me to the game, which was the Orcish Pie, which is 2 orcs in a room with a pie.
I think just one. Can just be
one orc in a room with a pie. Your goal is to get the pie. And then you talk to your players about, like, do you want to talk? You could talk to the orc. You could sneak past the orc. You could fight the orc. It's your choice, and then you watch them engage with it as they see fit. And it's a very simple scenario to try to just get them to grasp the concept of D&D. But beyond that, that's all you want to do in your first session. And then you jump into your first actual session of the game once people have a fundamental understanding. And the beginning of Lost Mine of Phandelver is perfect. There's some investigation, some exploration, and a little bit of combat right at the very beginning of that module. So it helps all three pillars.
Yeah.
Will the mutagenist have an option for a dex-oriented character? You're not going to...
Cool idea.
Yeah, but I think we designed the mutagenist so that all of their abilities are like fisty, punchy.
Yeah, it is. It is like a big hulking monster. Like it. To remember that the mutagenist is is still an apothecary, right? So the mutagenist, it actually doesn't matter what your strength score is because your strength and intelligence get flipped. You could probably really easily homebrew a version that swapped your dexterity and your strength, and it would work pretty well. But our kind of image for it was to do the big huge monster. So that is a cool idea actually, and they'll in an alternate reality maybe there is an alternate mutagenist that is a dex oriented one. That would be really cool. I like that idea. But no, it's not in the book.
Level 5 to 6 party are finally going to get revenge on a certain rat who escaped the nest. What sort of defenses and traps would ratlings set for defense? Spiky bits, rocks, think Ewoks, think kobolds. If you've heard of, Monty, help me out here. What's the famous kobold story?
Oh, Tucker's Kobolds.
Tucker's Kobolds. If you haven't heard of Tucker's Kobolds, look up the story of Tucker's Kobolds and use that as inspiration for ratlings.
You know what the biggest thing with ratlings, though, is? It's tunneling. So the ratlings are going to dig a burrow, and because ratlings are tunneling creatures, they're not afraid to collapse their passages and re-dig them. And so a collapsing tunnel that traps the players in a small chamber where they are running out of oxygen is really cool. Ratlings are also willing to do like improvised explosives and use delirium as sling bullets.
I could also see them doing really mean things, like because they're so good at tunneling, they can dig pits really quickly. And cause fake little pit traps, and probably because they have a bunch of delirium and they eat it for breakfast, they might put sharp delirium rocks at the bottom of a pit, which might cause contamination. That's a vicious trap. Ouch, I just thought of that. Wow, okay. Harsh.
I think the ratlings could also lure other monsters in as bait. So August Cornelius, Frost Schilling Hedegaard, wants to know, in what city did Cecilia von Kessel live? Leukten. Cecilia von Kessel lived in Drakkenheim. But she was not in the city on the day the meteor fell. And she then when the Civil War broke out, before the Civil War, she lived with Manfred von Kessel in Kesselholm. And then once they had a falling out, she made Leukten her capital. So complicated. She moved about a lot. But canonically, but you know, you can make it anything you want if you need to change it.
Kurai Akurai asks, do you think it's possible to run a D&D tournament? Whatever that means, do you think it can be done? Interesting that Monty and I have actually been talking about this. It already kind of exists. If you've ever played in an Adventures League game, you may have heard of D&D Epics. And so the concept of a D&D epic is that you have multiple tables with multiple DMs and multiple groups going on at the same time. However, they're all participating in one singular event, like a large-scale war or battle or heist or whatever. Either way, every table is participating in the same event. Depending on you have different level tiers. And depending on the level tier that the players at that table are in, they might have a different objective. For simplicity's sake, let's say there's a big war. One group, one or a few of the tables are trying to dismantle the siege weapons of the opponents. Well, another group is trying to open the gate of a wall to let their troops through. Another one is trying to infiltrate over the wall to sabotage something or other. And depending on the failures and successes of different tables, the game gets harder or easier for everybody. And on occasion, you have a master DM who walks from table to table with something like a dragon and slams it on the table one at a time and says, now the dragon's interfering with your table. And that is probably, in my opinion, how you run a tournament.
You know, the other thing that could be a tournament would be a dungeon, less a tournament and more a competition would be, I think it's easier to do competitions between dungeon masters. So I'm kind of imagining an Iron Chef sort of tournament where you have two dungeon masters that enter the arena and they are both given a set of parameters and like a secret ingredient that they have to use. And then they're both given a day to prepare an adventure. And then they run that adventure for a panel of judges. And then the judges choose who ran the better adventure.
Well, Monty, we could, let's pitch this. Let's make a reality TV show on D&D and you and I can be the judges. We'll get some like celebrity DMs to be judges. It'll be great.
Yeah,
let's do it.
Yeah.
Let's.
I think that would be cool though, don't you? Like that would be that would be one way to do it, right?
Yeah, I want to be on a reality TV show as a judge. I mean, it sounds more fun than being on a reality TV show, but
yeah,
a D&D reality TV show. Why not? We've done everything else.
Lucas Prange wants to know: do you think it's better for a new DM to start with a campaign book or create their own campaign?
I highly recommend starting with, even if you have a million ideas, starting with a campaign book teaches you a lot about flow, structure, what you like, and what you don't like. Mm-hmm. I tried, and some DMs do this. Some DMs do this and are great. So if you want to do it, don't listen to me. But I tried writing a homebrew campaign before ever running a module as a DM because I had played a bunch of D&D. And so I was like, well, I've played a bunch. I have some ideas. I want to make my own stuff up. But my ability to design dungeons, my ability to design encounters, my ability to include all the pillars of play were very rough around the edges as I started my DMing in a homebrew setting. I was sort of pretty rough for a while. Monty continually poked holes in my first campaign by showing me all the things I hadn't thought of. He did it kindly because he was playing a character who was very good at being like, well, I'm going to build a ladder and climb up to the top floor of your house. And I'm like, you can't build a ladder. And he's like, we just came from a town. Is there wood? And I'm like, well, yeah. And he's like, is there a carpenter in town? I'm like, yeah. And he's like, we go back to the town and we get them to build us a ladder. And I'm like, what do I do? And those were valuable lessons for me. When I ran a module, I gained a lot of very important knowledge on flow, structure, even structures of how to set up battles, encounters, wilderness exploration. So at least run Lost Mine of Phandelver if you want a small snippet. Once you're done that, you can start homebrewing, but I very highly recommend taking in the flow of a campaign before jumping into designing your own. That's my recommendation personally.
I agree. I mean, ultimately, it's not impossible to do it. The thing is it really depends on you and your personal preferences. And what you think you need to learn. And I will say that, like, even for myself, like, I remember the starter kit that I had for 3rd edition that had this weird little dungeon map, and just running my friends through it. Like, even if you're, and again, it comes back to what we were saying earlier of starting small. Like, you can finish Lost Mine to Phandelver in 8 to 10 game sessions. That will take you, if you play every week, that takes you 3 months. And so that way you get that experience, and then you don't have to continue. You can say, once we're done Phandelver, we're going to do my own campaign. And you'll learn so much in that process. I really think the learning is really, really, really good, right? So I would recommend it, I think. I think that as a community, we could probably develop a much better learning experience for first-time DMs. But maybe that's a future project.
You know who? This is a weird callback, but we have a wonderful friend, Josh, who he wanted to try DMing, and so he invited a bunch of us over to his place. And I was like, I wonder what Josh is going to cook up. And he actually did what might be the single best introductory session of D&D that I ever participated in. It was, we were on a reality show in the game sort of thing. We were like contestants, and we had to go into separate rooms and solve puzzles. The first one was like these scarecrows popped up, and we had to like attack them and use our weapons, and we got points for who did the coolest kill. Then the next one was like, we had to like solve a riddle or a puzzle of some sort. There was exploration. And then the next one was like, we had to go unseen. He basically had each room represent a pillar of play, and we had to engage with it in a non-lethal format. And by the end of it, I remember just being like, Josh, this should be used to introduce new players to the game of D&D, because it really allowed players to engage with every aspect of D&D without fear of their characters dying. It was still really fun. We were in a tavern just doing like a game show. It was really cool.
Cool. Grabbing another question from our patrons, Lady Kathy wants to know, in the world of Drakkenheim, in the continent, a Mageborn cannot sit on the throne of a nation due to the Edicts of Lumen. But does this include druids? They use nature magic and are a class by themselves. So this is probably the question about the Edicts of Lumen, and like what counts as magic under the Edicts of Lumen, and the nobility is one of the biggest questions about the world building and lore of the world of Drakkenheim that we get. And I want to start off by saying that the Edicts of Lumen are a treaty between nations. They are not written on these. There was one version where the Edicts of Lumen were written on the golden plates of the Inevitables, and if they were broken, the Inevitables would be summoned and destroy whichever people who had violated them. And I realized that that was less interesting than having the Edicts of Lumen just be a treaty written on a piece of paper that if they were broken or violated, whoever violated them was just accountable to the other people that inhabit the world. And so if you want to stretch the letter of the Edicts of Lumen, you just have to try. And the intent behind it is not that you can't, it's that it's always going to be a struggle. So if a player character is a druid and they want to claim a noble lineage or a royal lineage, people will oppose them. And they will oppose them, and maybe that player character will need to change the edicts or find a way to justify it or find a way to explain it. But it could happen. Should it happen without conflict? Absolutely not. The Edicts of Lumen exist to create a conflict that the players can either decide they want to obey the edicts because they think that the edicts represent an important societal framework, or that they think the edicts are an antiquated and unnecessary set of laws that need to be antiquated. In the world of Drakenheim, the society of the world of Drakenheim really only thinks that there's two kinds of magic: the arcane magic of mages and the divine magic of clerics of the sacred flame and paladins of the sacred flame. A layperson that doesn't know that there's other kinds of magic thinks that a druid is a sorcerer. They think that a cleric who's not a cleric of the sacred flame, but a cleric of one of the old gods, they think that they're a demon-worshipping cultist. They think that druids who worship the old gods are demon-worshipping cultists. There's people that understand that that's not true. But the fact of the matter is there's powerful people in the world who believe that. So it's meant to be a conflict more than anything else.
Yeah, I think just to piggyback off of that, like druids specifically, it's interesting because they're not specifically mentioned in the Edicts of Lumen. So they're kind of a contentious point. Same with bards, same with even like eldritch knights or arcane tricksters, who are mostly seen as petty dabblers. But it is interesting that like we actually have a story in the new book about a bard who rose to take the king's moot in Caspia, became the high king, and was like, well, I'm not really a mage, I'm just a bard, so don't worry about it. But Caspia saw it that way. Illyria said, no, you're mage-born, and you need to step down or we're going to kill you. And that started a huge war because Illyria said one thing, Caspia said the other. Mm-hmm. So a druid from Westamar who has noble title might have the support of Westamar. Yeah. But because we want it to be interesting, Illyria might show up on the doorstep and say, nope, we don't like it. And that's the point of the Edicts of Lumen, is any character can claim a noble title. Who is going to be upset about it is the question. Yeah. And the Edicts of Lumen answer that like somebody's upset about something.
Yeah. And people in chat are pointing out, but the Illyrians have violated the Edicts of Lumen because the Divine Matriarch is the ruler. The Divine Matriarch is not the ruler of Illyria, officially on paper. The Divine Matriarch is absolutely the most politically influential person in Illyria, and has been for hundreds of years. But there's a Lord Regent of Illyria. It just so happens the Lord Regent defers to the Divine Matriarch on virtually all matters of state. And so that's the type of thing of where maybe your druid player is like, oh, all right, we're gonna play the Illyrian ball game here. We're gonna find some sort of interesting way of having a Lord Regent or some sort of there. It's meant to be a provocation. So what we actually have attempted to do with Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakenheim is show all the ways that people in the world have tried to get around the Edicts of Lumen, right? Because at the end of the day, the Edicts of Lumen are a 300-year-old document written by a bunch of people who had different thoughts and values at the time compared to the people of the present, and maybe we shouldn't make political documents that go unchallenged for hundreds of years and don't change, because the world changes. So
yeah, so I mean, you might find a little dabbling of messy human politics, which is very much intentional. Yeah, messy human politics are interesting, and the world can never agree on what the right answer to anything is, and that's true in our world as well. This is a very interesting question. We get things like this all the time, but at the end of the day, I think a lot of people think the Edicts of Lumen are a fantastical document that will smite you down if you break it. But it's not. People are breaking it all over the place. It's just who finds out that it's being broken, and are they okay with it or are they not okay with it? And that's where you as a DM get to tell interesting stories.
And the meta, like from a creator's perspective, my sort of vision, and maybe I'm bearing the lead here because my player is right here, is that my sort of vision is that the Edicts of Lumen are meant to be so problematic that there's almost certainly going to be a war over them again. But that's one of the themes of this setting. Is that there's always going to be political conflict, and sometimes war breaks out over it. And sometimes those wars are avoided and peace is negotiated, and sometimes they're not. And that's what happens in real life too. And it is, as Kelly said, it's meant to be messy, right? People don't make logical decisions, and not all legal documents and treaties are wisely negotiated. They have flaws. And those flaws create interesting conflicts by which we can tell cool stories that have thinly veiled political references, but are far enough away from anything in the real world that everyone can still enjoy them without getting into a real world political argument.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Brad Allen asks, we're getting ready for Dungeons of Drakkenheim, and I'm looking to play a changeling who's less fey, more delirium caused with the shape-shifting. Is its setting appropriate? This is something that I want to be very specific about with my answer to this. I think if a player wants to play a character and they see a tie-in to delirium within their backstory that could be cool, I think that you should allow it. But it's very, very important that you make sure to treat whatever influence has caused them to be the way that they are, they still don't gain any benefits to dealing with delirium, contamination, no immunity, no anything. It's almost like, okay, I'm going to use a weird analogy here. I don't know where I'm going with it, but just bear with me. Spider-Man gets bitten by a spider, or Peter Parker gets bitten by a spider, becomes Spider-Man. A few days later, Peter Parker gets bitten by another poisonous spider and dies of spider poison. Just because one turned him into Spider-Man doesn't mean the next one is going to turn him into an even better Spider-Man. So if your changeling became a changeling because of delirium contamination, they survived, luckily, that instance. But going back into Drakenheim, you run the rules as it is. You don't change anything about the setting for them. It's a cool story note, and so I say thumbs up to cool story notes, thumbs up to your players engaging with the setting, but you want them to also have the same struggles, because part of the campaign Dungeons of Drakkenheim is how are the players going to deal with contamination and delirium, and that stunts their progression further into the campaign and allows them to build up to the bigger parts of the adventure.
Petrus906 wants to know, what is the name of the continent or the planet? It sounds weird when I think about hearing the world of Drakenheim. The people of the world of Drakenheim call their continent the continent because they haven't started traveling to other continents enough. They do, but they just think of it as the continent. And they call their planet the Earth because that's what we call our planet. Like, it doesn't have a special name because our planet doesn't really have a special name. It's just the Earth, right? And they don't really. The people are only dimly, like, you have to put yourself in the mentality of like, people don't have a whole awareness of the wider world around them like we do in the modern world. So I think that maybe I've long toyed with this idea that maybe the people in the world call the continent something like they refer to it in the same way that in the Middle Ages they thought of their world as Christendom. And I've thought about maybe the Sacred Flame has a name for all the places that worship the Sacred Flame. But I haven't really, and for a while I thought it was going to be like something along those lines, but then I played Horizon Zero Dawn and they used the term the Karja Sundom, and I thought that sounded stupid. So I dropped that idea.
Oh man, I like the Sundom.
I don't know.
I have zero bad things to say about Horizon.
I love Horizon. I just was like, I don't love the Sundom, and I thought about like doing like a riff of like, you know, could it be like the Flamedom? But that sounds weird, doesn't it?
Here's what I'll say. Here's my answer. When we create a second continent, we'll probably name them.
Yeah, we'll probably have to name the continent when there's a second continent. Yeah.
But for now, the entire world that we're existing in is one continent, one Earth. So they are battling amongst themselves with nations and people.
Yeah.
They don't care about what their continent is called because they haven't had to decide that yet. It might even be that Westmar, Caspia, and Illyria have different names for what they think the continent is. But we use the term World of Drakenheim the same way that Greyhawk uses World of Greyhawk. It's based on the major city in this and the major setting.
Raven Emeritus brings up this point is like, I feel like with the existence of other planes gives added incentive to naming their planet or the continent, the denizens of other planes having a name for it. The denizens of other planes just call it the mortal world. Because you also have to remember that in the world of Drakkenheim, the planar concepts are only dimly understood by most people living in the world, right? People know that there are other worlds, but those are the stuff of myths and legends for the common folk. And even amongst the nobility, they don't really think about the other planes of, like, they think that's a place of nightmares. Like, that's a place that the mages of the Amethyst Academy know about. Or, you know, that's the afterlife. So the people of this world don't have, like, that wide spanning awareness of the vastness of their actual world. They think about it, they think about the conflicts of their continent, they think about the conflicts of their kingdoms, and they haven't yet come into that type of thinking yet. Yeah.
I think one last point, we're almost out of time here, but one last point that I do want to get in that echoes a lot of this is I think another very important aspect to remember for the world of Drakkenheim is that the events that you watched in the show and the events that take place at the table are wholly unique and different from the standard of the world. There aren't mages flying around everywhere. There aren't great catastrophes of epic proportions and world-ending events all the time that great heroes step up to stop. The heroes that are the player characters are the only people like them in the whole world. The NPCs that are very, very powerful are the only people like them in the whole world. Most, I'm going to say 98% of people in the world are farmers, peasants, people who exist in very much a real world medieval setting where they're just trying to do their best, trying not to die of horrible diseases, trying to keep their farm. And when they hear that the capital city has been struck by a meteor and there's monsters pouring out, a lot of people are like, I don't understand what you mean. That doesn't sound real to me.
Yeah.
Planar travel, wizards, when they see a wizard of the Amethyst Academy, it's like seeing an A-list celebrity walk down the street where you do a double take and you're like, did I just see Brad Pitt walk by?
Yeah. And it's like, you know that Brad Pitt exists in the world, but you never think you're going to see Brad Pitt in person in your life unless you actually interact with that world, right? So yeah.
So it's very much a world of mundane people, and the stories that we're telling are the exceptions to that mundane world.
Yep. So with that, fantastic questions tonight. We didn't even get to get all of them the chat sent us, and thank you to all of our patrons who sent amazing questions. Our apologies if we didn't get to your question. You know, we always have to select a pool of all those questions, but there were so many great ones that were asked, and we're going to be doing a lot more Q&As. So for those of you that are following along, Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakenheim launches at 10 a.m. on Monday, August 15th. It'll be going on till mid-September for the Kickstarter, but if you back in the first 48 hours, you're going to get a poster of the cover art thrown in your pledge, as long as you back a physical reward tier. That night, on Monday, we're doing something special, Kelly. What are we going to do?
At 6:00 p.m., Monty and I are going to be back here. We're doing it on, is it going to be on YouTube or Twitch, Monty?
It'll be on YouTube, yep.
All right, so back here on YouTube, and we are going to be doing another live stream. It's going to be similar, but I think we're only going to be chatting with chat. It's not going to be...
we're going to have some special guests, though.
We are going to have some special guests.
Yeah.
We are going to have some of our beloved members of Ghostfire Gaming here to help answer questions, because Monty and I are going to be able to answer all of your questions about the content, but they will be able to answer your questions about sort of the peripheral items, fulfillment, and all of the fun Kickstarter stuff that's going to be happening. So we're going to have a couple guests. And we're going to be chatting about Drakenheim. We're probably also going to just be here to celebrate a little bit, hopefully, I imagine we're going to be celebrating the first day of our Kickstarter, the launch, how it's going. We might have a page open on the side where Monty and I will just be yelling out numbers as we get backers. So please join us on Monday evening while we sit, chill, and hang out and talk about all the cool things that are being shown this Monday for Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakenheim.
Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you to our patrons as well. If you want to become a patron of our show, patreon.com/dungeon_dudes is the place to visit. Thank you all so much, and we will see you soon
in the dungeon. Bye.